Imagine for a second that you are looking at this incredibly pristine architectural blueprint.
Right, like something straight out of a design firm.
Exactly. It is clean, it's precise, drawn in these really sharp lines on stark white paper. You see exactly where the load-bearing walls go. You see the wiring, the plumbing.
Everything just makes perfect logical sense on paper.
Right. But then you step away from the drafting table and you walk onto the actual construction site. And it is, frankly, absolute chaos.
Chaos.
The ground is literally shifting beneath your feet. Thousands of people are moving into the unfinished floors while the concrete is still wet, and the supply trucks are, I don't know, stuck in traffic miles down the road.
Which is a terrifying way to build a house, by the way.
Oh, absolutely. But that contrast between the pristine theoretical plan and the messy, vibrating, often overwhelming reality of a massive structure coming to life, that is exactly what we are looking at today.
It really is.
Welcome to today's deep dive. Our source material today is incredibly unique. We are decoding a custom-tailored 15-page data presentation.
Yeah, an academic slide deck.
Right, an academic slide deck analyzing the socioeconomic transition of Benin. And to you listening, I want to set the scene visually because the design language here is super deliberate.
It's very striking.
It is. We're talking minimalist, stark white backgrounds, flat design. There are no flashy 3D effects or gradients here.
Just pure, rigorous data storytelling.
Exactly. Like slide 1, the cover page, it just has this stark, dark gray title on the left. And on the right, there's just a subtle light gray outline of the map of Benin acting as a background accent.
It really sets a serious tone.
It does, because the mission here is to understand a nation attempting to make a monumental leap from a survival economy to a productive economy. And the stakes here go way beyond the borders of one West African country.
They absolutely do, because what we are looking at in this data is essentially a high-resolution blueprint of the exact challenges facing the entire global south today. We'd like to think of national development as this orderly, step-by-step staircase. First, you get agriculture right, then you build light industry, then heavy industry, then services.
That was the European model, right? Over like 2 centuries.
Exactly, over 2 centuries. But on the ground today, in places like Benin, it is a high-wire balancing act performed during a hurricane. Everything is happening all at once.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because on slide 2, the executive summary, the deck uses these 4 distinct information blocks outlined in thin black lines to show the macro trends.
The macroeconomics, population health, education, and digital infrastructure.
Right, with these simple dark blue arrows pointing up or down. And the core conclusion hits you right away. Benin is making massive leaps in public health and education, but it is staring down the barrel of severe infrastructure shortages and super vulnerable employment.
It's the paradox of modern development. Rapid growth colliding head-on with structural bottlenecks.
So let's start with the absolute foundation of this construction site, the people. Slide 3 covers the demographic explosion, and the numbers here are just staggering.
They really are hard to wrap your head around.
Historically, Benin's total population was around 2.51 million. Today, it has skyrocketed to over 13 million people.
And that's represented by this massive, steep, dark gray line on the chart?
Yes, exactly. And it's not just that there are more people, it's where they are going. The urbanization rate is accelerating. The deck actually highlights this with a red dashed circle around the recent years, showing the urban growth rate hovering in the 4 to 5% range annually.
To put that 4 to 5% urbanization rate into perspective for you, it means cities are essentially doubling in size in terms of infrastructure demand every 15 years or so.
Wow, every 15 years.
Yeah. You are taking a population that is multiplying by 5 overall, and simultaneously the center of gravity is aggressively shifting from the countryside into the urban centers.
But here's the thing that trips me up. Usually when we hear about explosive population growth in a developing context, the immediate assumption is a deepening of poverty, right?
Right, the idea that the pie is being sliced into thinner and thinner pieces.
Exactly. But slide 4, which tracks the macroeconomic growth, shows the exact opposite. While the population multiplied by 5, the GDP per capita made a quantum leap.
A massive leap.
We are talking about a historical low of around $90 per person, skyrocketing to over $1,300 today.
And the slide actually adds a text box and a leader line pointing to the mid to late 2000s, labeling it the accelerated growth period.
Right, the line just goes nearly vertical. So wait, how does a country physically absorb 5 times as many people rapidly shove them into cities, and somehow everyone mathematically gets 14 times richer.
That is the core paradox here, and the answer lies in understanding the transition from absolute rural subsistence to a monetized economy.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, when a population moves from growing exactly what they eat, where their economic output is barely captured in GDP, to moving into a city, engaging in trade, providing services, and, utilizing even basic technology, the monetized value of their labor spikes.
Ah, I see.
It's a monumental demographic and economic shift happening in the span of a single generation.
I want to make sure you, the listener, can really visualize what this means on the ground. Picture your own hometown, right? Think about the streets, the local schools, the water supply.
The grocery stores?
Yeah, the local grocery stores. Now imagine that population multiplying by 5 over just a few decades. Every single family of 4 is now 20 people.
It's unimaginable pressure on local systems.
Exactly. And at the exact same time, every person in that town suddenly has 14 times more money to spend. The teenager who couldn't afford a bicycle now wants a moped.
The family that ate solely what they grew now wants to buy imported rice, packaged goods, and a mobile phone.
Right. The sheer physical and logistical pressure of that rapid urbanization combined with sudden wealth is immense. It triggers a massive spike in aggregate demand.
They want better food, they want consumer goods, they want services, and that immediately raises the terrifying question, where do you put everyone?
And more importantly, how do you feed them? Which brings us right to the collision point on slide 5. We have 13 million people, they all have more money in their pockets, and the immediate unavoidable consequence of that is a massive spike in demand for food.
But when we look at how Benin is actually generating that food and organizing its economic structure, the foundation starts to look incredibly precarious.
It really does. Slide 5 breaks down the 3 sectors of the economy using these really muted, low saturation colors: gray, light blue, and navy. No 3D effects, just flat data.
And it shows an economy essentially running on a 2-cylinder engine.
Right. Services have historically maintained the lion's share, sitting between 43% and 55% of GDP.
And industry, which is typically the driver of middle-class job creation, remains quite low and volatile.
But agriculture is the wild card here. It fluctuates widely, anywhere from 24% to 46% of GDP. And the slide actually uses this translucent gray mask to highlight the years where the agriculture share dips, labeling it a structural tweak.
And this is where the data gets deeply alarming. If we move to slide 6, we see the deep crisis in the agricultural sector.
Yeah, this slide contrasts a bar chart of total agricultural value with a line graph of arable land per capita. The absolute value generated by agriculture has increased. They are producing more total value.
But the arable land per capita is plummeting.
Right. Historically, Benin had about 0.4 hectares of arable land per person. Today, that has been squeezed down to less than 0.25 hectares. And there's this big red downward arrow emphasizing that drop.
And that downward trend line is arguably the most dangerous metric in this entire analysis. It is a direct, unavoidable mathematical consequence of the demographic explosion we just discussed.
So 0.25 hectares. For context, you listening, that is roughly half the size of an American football field.
It's tiny.
That is the total amount of physical dirt available to grow the food required to sustain one human being for an entire year. And it's shrinking. So let me just state the obvious fear here.
Go for it.
If the pie, the total agricultural value, is getting more valuable, but every person's physical slice of the land is shrinking by almost half, aren't we heading toward a cliff regarding food security? I mean, you can't just wish more calories out of a smaller patch of dirt.
We absolutely are heading toward a cliff unless there's a radical transformation in how that dirt is utilized. You cannot sustain a 5-fold population increase on a shrinking per capita land footprint using historical manual farming methods.
It's just mathematically impossible.
Exactly. It's an ecological and mathematical impossibility. As families grow, land gets subdivided among children. Smaller plots mean you can't leave land fallow to recover its nutrients.
Which leads to soil depletion.
Precisely. The only way out of that trap is aggressive agricultural modernization.
Meaning what, exactly? What does modernization look like when your plot is half a football field?
Well, it means moving away from rainfall-dependent subsistence farming. It requires advanced irrigation systems so you can grow year-round. It requires high-yield, drought-resistant seed varieties.
Right, and chemical fertilizers to replace the nutrients being stripped from the overfarmed soil.
And eventually it requires mechanized farming and aggregation. combining those tiny plots into larger commercial farms that can operate efficiently with tractors and modern equipment.
Wait, hold on. If you bring in tractors and hyper-efficient high-yield methods, you need fewer farmers, right?
Yes, significantly fewer.
You consolidate the land, you mechanize, and suddenly 10 families who used to work that land are out of a job. But you just told me we have a booming massive youth population.
That's the catch.
If we hyper-efficientize farming to solve the food security crisis, aren't we just accelerating the unemployment crisis by pushing millions of obsolete agricultural workers into those rapidly expanding cities?
That is the exact crucible of development. Yes, agricultural modernization frees up or forces out labor. Historically, where did that labor go?
It went into the cities to work in the factories.
Exactly. That is the Industrial Revolution in a nutshell. But for that transition to work, you need the factories to be there, ready to absorb those workers.
And building factories, just like buying tractors and building irrigation canals, requires massive amounts of capital. It requires investment.
Which brings us to the multi-billion-dollar question on slide 7. Where is Benin getting the money to fund this transition?
Because if they need to build cities, modernize agriculture, and somehow industrialize simultaneously to absorb this population, the capital requirements are just astronomical.
Astronomical. And when we follow the money trail in this data, we hit a wall of absolute contradiction.
It's a stark reality check. Slide 7 shows us two very different streams of money, and the visual contrast here is huge.
Right. Official development assistance versus foreign direct investment.
Exactly. The first is ODA. This is foreign aid grants and concessional loans from international bodies, foreign governments, global NGOs. The second is FDI. This is private international capital.
A multinational corporation deciding to spend its own money to build a processing plant, a logistics hub, or a factory in Benin.
And the contrast between those two is night and day. Capital formation in Benin is highly, almost precariously, dependent on foreign aid. In certain years, net ODA has accounted for upwards of 40% of total capital formation.
40%. That means nearly half of the investment in the country's physical and social infrastructure was funded by international goodwill and public grants.
That's the private sector. The private sector is largely absent. Slide 7 actually uses a circular highlight to emphasize just how low the FDI is. Foreign direct investment net inflows hover between 0% and 2% of GDP.
And occasionally the data even shows them dipping into negative territory.
Negative, meaning more private capital is actively fleeing the country than entering it.
Exactly. It means existing foreign investors are liquidating assets or pulling profits out rather than reinvesting them locally.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let me give you an analogy to frame this, to you listening, because it helps explain the psychology of capital. Imagine a tech startup, okay?
Okay, I like this.
This startup has an incredibly charismatic founder and a mission that everyone believes in, say. They're building cheap water filtration systems. Because the mission is so noble and the narrative is so compelling, they are able to win endless government research grants, nonprofit backing, and university fellowships.
That's the 40% ODA.
Exactly. The international community loves the narrative and wants to help. But when that same founder walks into a room full of venture capitalist people whose only job is to calculate risk, return, and legal liability, they cannot convince a single VC to actually invest their own money into the business model.
And that is the 0 to 2% FDI.
That's it.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it, because the motivations of those two capital streams are fundamentally different. International donors and multilateral institutions, the ODA providers, they measure their return on investment in terms of human lives saved, poverty reduction, and regional geopolitical stability.
Right, they aren't looking for a quarterly profit.
No, not at all. They are willing to absorb massive inefficiencies and risks because their goal is humanitarian and developmental. But private capital, a multinational manufacturing firm looking to build a new textile factory.
They measure return and profit margins, supply chain efficiency, and legal certainty.
Exactly. Capital is a coward. It runs from uncertainty. It doesn't care about a compelling humanitarian narrative. It cares about whether the power grid will stay on so the factory can run, and whether a local court will enforce a contract if a supplier defaults.
So an economy that is heavily reliant on informal services and subsistence agriculture with low industrial capacity simply doesn't scream safe, high-yield investment to a global portfolio manager.
Precisely. If those conditions aren't met, the private money stays away.
But before we get too cynical about this lack of private investment, I think we have to pause And look at what that massive influx of foreign aid actually
Oh,
achieved.
absolutely.
Because there's a narrative out there that foreign aid is just a black hole. Did the ODA work? If the international community poured all this money in, what did it actually buy? And the data from slides 8 through 10 screams an emphatic yes.
It worked on a scale that is almost hard to comprehend. It is arguably one of the most profound human success stories hidden within macroeconomic data.
Let's look at slide 8, public health. There's this massive green downward arrow on the slide that just grabs your attention. It's pointing to the drop in infant mortality.
Historically, Benin saw infant mortality highs of over 160 deaths per 1,000 live births.
Just pause on that.
No.
160 out of 1,000. That means roughly 16% of all children born did not survive infancy. It was a tragedy of immense normalized proportions.
And today, that number has plummeted. The slide shows it dropping to the 30 to 50 range. Neonatal mortality has seen a similar dramatic cliff dive.
How does a country actually execute a drop like that? It's not just a matter of throwing money at a hospital building, right? What are the actual mechanisms that drive infant mortality down that fast?
It is incredibly complex logistics disguised as basic healthcare. It's the deployment of cold chain infrastructure.
Like specialized refrigeration.
Yes, refrigerators that can operate reliably in rural areas, often on solar power, just to keep vaccines viable. It's the mass distribution of insecticide-treated bed nets to eliminate malaria as a primary killer of infants.
Wow.
It's training thousands of community health workers in basic neonatal care and sanitation. This is where ODA truly shines. You can fund a targeted vertical health intervention like a national vaccination drive and see immediate, measurable results without needing a fully industrialized economy to support it.
And it doesn't stop with infant survival. Slide 9 shows a massive victory against infectious diseases. The chart on the left shows HIV incidence among youth, specifically ages 15 to 24. It dropped sharply from nearly 3.0 per 1,000 uninfected people down to under 0.2.
And there's a solid circle drawn on the turning point of that curve, noting the effective combination of policy and international aid.
It's an astonishing compression of an epidemic. And right alongside that, on the right side of the slide, a bar chart shows tuberculosis treatment success rates climbing and stabilizing between 80% and 90%.
You really have to internalize the human scale of these numbers. We aren't just discussing abstract data points on a white background. This represents millions of human beings.
Yeah, children who survive their first 5 years, teenagers who are protected from a generational epidemic, adults who are cured of a debilitating respiratory disease and could return to their families.
This is the ultimate triumph of coordinated public health policy funded heavily by that international goodwill.
And because those children are surviving, and because the youth are healthy, they need somewhere to go. Which brings us to slide 10 and the next massive shift, education.
The leaps in primary school completion are just massive.
The numbers here are wild. Female primary school completion rose from under 10% to around 70%. Let that sink in. From fewer than 1 in 10 girls finishing primary school to 7 out of 10.
And male completion rose from the 20% range to roughly 80%.
Think about the logistical lift required for that. You have a population multiplying by 5, meaning the raw number of children entering the system is astronomical. Yet, despite that volumetric pressure, the rate of completion skyrocketed.
You are taking a population that was previously locked out of formal knowledge systems and bringing millions of children into the classroom. You are building schools, training teachers, distributing materials, again, heavily supported by ODA.
It is worth celebrating, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a miracle of human development. But you knew there was a but coming.
Always is.
Even with these gains, the data explicitly points out a persistent gap. Slide 10 has this two-way arrow highlighting the space between male and female completion rates. Yes, both saw massive gains, but a 10% gap remains.
The slide specifically notes that educational equity still needs deepening.
Right, and when I think about the mechanisms on the ground, I have to assume this isn't just about school capacity. Why are those last few percentage points so hard to close for girls?
Because you transition from solving logistical problems to confronting deep socioeconomic realities. Building a school is a logistical problem, but convincing a rural family living on less than a hectare of land to send their daughter to that school instead of having her help with agricultural labor or fetch water is a socioeconomic problem.
Ah, I see.
There's an opportunity cost to education for families in subsistence economies. And historically, when resources are incredibly tight, families have prioritized the education of male children.
So how do you fix that?
Closing that final gap requires deeper interventions. Things like conditional cash transfers to families who keep their daughters in school, or ensuring schools have proper safe sanitation facilities for adolescent girls.
Right, it's about changing the incentive structure at the household level.
Hmm.
But this massive success in health and education forces me to ask a really uncomfortable question. We have engineered a massive, healthy, educated youth population. We have millions of newly healthy youth, especially all these young women who are now surviving childhood, dodging epidemics, and finishing school.
Yes.
What happens to them when they graduate and step out into the workforce?
And this is where the entire narrative pivots from triumph to a severe structural trap. If we look at slide 11, the economic reality waiting to receive this youth boom is incredibly harsh.
You've successfully built the human capital, but the economy hasn't evolved fast enough to utilize it.
Exactly. Let's look at the labor market trap, specifically focusing on female employment, because the data here is jaw-dropping. The slide uses a ring chart comparing dark gray and light gray segments. The participation rate is high, women are absolutely working, but the data categorizes over 90% of this work as vulnerable employment.
90%. And there's a leader line pointing right from that 90% chunk to a text box that says, formal wage jobs are extremely scarce.
We need to explore what vulnerable employment actually looks like in the context of Benin today. It isn't a Western concept of the gig economy where someone is driving an Uber between acting auditions.
Right, it's not freelance graphic design.
No. In this macroeconomic context, vulnerable employment means unpaid family workers or self-employed workers operating entirely in the informal economy without a single shred of a social safety net.
So what is the day-to-day reality of that?
It means selling produce by the side of an unpaved road. It means doing piecework tailoring out of a home. It means subsistence farming on that shrinking 0.25 hectare plot.
With no protections whatsoever.
Zero. There is no sick leave. There's no pension. There is no legal protection if you get injured, or if a supplier cheats you, or if the police decide to clear your market stall. If you do not physically work that day, your family does not eat.
And for over 90% of working women in Benin, that is their daily reality. The slide also notes that less than 1% of women are classified as employers.
It's just staggering.
Imagine doing everything right. You survive childhood in a country that used to have a 16% infant mortality rate. You dodge infectious diseases. You finish primary school against the historical odds, overcoming the socioeconomic pressures to drop out.
You do everything you were supposed to do.
Right. You step out into the adult world ready to contribute, equipped with basic literacy and numeracy. And you step into an economy where 9 out of 10 jobs offer zero security, no regular paycheck, and no ladder for upward mobility. It is heartbreaking.
It really is.
Why is the formal job market so anemic? Why aren't there formal corporate offices or massive textile factories or standardized retail chains absorbing this labor?
To understand why those formal jobs don't exist, we have to skip ahead slightly to slide 14 and connect this back to our earlier conversation about foreign direct investment, that 0 to 2% figure.
Ah, right. The missing private capital.
Exactly. We have to look at the institutional and regulatory context. This is the root of the problem, the actual bottleneck in the funnel. Slide 14 puts two charts side by side, Benin's rule of law ranking and its regulatory quality ranking.
And there's a gray baseline drawn across the charts at the 30th percentile mark to show just how low these rank globally.
Right. The rule of law ranks in the 23rd to 46th percentile globally, and regulatory quality is stuck mostly between the 25th and 40th percentiles. There's a text bubble pointing out that institution building is lagging way behind economic growth.
Let's translate that into plain English.
Yeah.
What does 25th percentile regulatory quality actually mean for a business?
It means the rules of the game are muddy, unpredictable, and expensive to navigate. Imagine you are that multinational manufacturing firm we talked about earlier. You want to build a factory that will employ 5,000 people in formal, wage-paying jobs.
Which is exactly what the country needs.
Yes, but before you pour concrete, you need permits. In an environment with low regulatory quality, getting those permits might take years, or it might require navigating a labyrinth of informal bribes and opaque bureaucracies.
And what about the rule of law ranking? What does that matter to a factory?
That is even more critical. Rule of law dictates contract enforcement. If you build that factory and your local supplier fails to deliver the raw materials you already paid for, what is your recourse?
You sue them, right?
Well, in a high rule of law environment, yes, you go to court, the contract is enforced, and you recover your money swiftly. In a 23rd percentile rule of law environment, that court case might drag on for a decade, or the judge might be influenced by local politics. Your capital is entirely at risk.
Capital is a coward.
Precisely. And this regulatory friction is the direct answer to the mystery of the missing FDI. Private companies do not build multi-million-dollar factories, the exact kind of factories that provide formal, wage-paying jobs with benefits, sick leave, and safety standards in an environment with low regulatory quality and unpredictable rule of law.
So because the institutions haven't matured fast enough to attract private investment, the factories aren't built.
And because the factories aren't built, the newly educated, healthy youth population is forced right back into the informal, vulnerable economy just to survive.
It's an institutional bottleneck. You've poured millions of gallons of water into the top of the funnel, massive investments in health and education. But the bottom of the funnel, the regulatory and institutional environment, is incredibly narrow.
So all that human potential just spills over the sides into the informal sector.
And while this population is hustling day in and day out in this informal economy, they're simultaneously navigating a physical and technological landscape that is mutating almost daily. Which brings us back to slide 12 and 13.
This is a fascinating analytical layer, the environmental costs and the digital landscape. Because the way this population interacts with infrastructure is a study in extreme contradictions.
Let's start with the physical environment on slide 12. The data shows absolute carbon emissions are rising noticeably, which isn't surprising given the economic growth. But the deck specifically highlights the transport and waste sectors.
Right, there's a dashed box emphasizing the upward trajectory here.
Yeah, transport emissions alone jumped from under 0.1 megatons of CO2 equivalent to over 0.5 megatons. It's a massive relative spike.
This is the messy reality of rapid urbanization playing out in the atmosphere. You have a population multiplying by 5, moving into cities, and gaining access to a bit more disposable income.
Right.
What is the first thing a newly urbanized worker buys when they save up some money? Mobility. They buy a cheap, imported 2-stroke motorbike. They buy a heavily used, older model car. They start consuming packaged goods, which generates municipal waste.
But the city itself hasn't kept up with that consumption.
Exactly. The city's physical infrastructures, the paved roads, the public transit networks, the centralized waste management systems hasn't scaled up at the same 5x rate.
Because it takes decades and billions of dollars to build a subway system or a modern sanitation grid.
Yes. So you get millions of individual motorbikes idling in massive traffic jams on unpaved or poorly maintained roads, and you get overwhelmed informal sanitation systems. That friction between rising consumer capacity and lagging municipal infrastructure is what drives up those specific emission categories.
But while the physical infrastructure is choking on its own growth, the digital infrastructure is doing something completely wild on slide 13.
It's a totally different story.
When we look at technology, the mobile cellular subscriptions have seen explosive exponential growth, breaking the 10 million mark. The slide has this bold upward arrow labeled leapfrogging. In a country of 13 million people, almost everyone is getting a cell phone.
What's fascinating here is that concept of leapfrogging. Benin, like many nations in the global south, is entirely bypassing the 20th century model of infrastructure development.
They didn't spend 50 years laying down millions of miles of copper telephone wire to connect every rural home to a landline grid.
They simply skipped that entire technological epoch. They leapfrogged straight over landlines and went directly to building cellular towers. The adoption rate is blistering because the barrier to entry is just a cheap handset.
And it's not just for making calls, right? Mobile technology in these economies is the banking system.
Absolutely. Mobile money platforms bypass the need for physical brick-and-mortar bank branches. A farmer with a 0.25 hectare plot can receive payment for their crops directly to their phone, bypassing middlemen. It is a profound democratizer of basic commerce.
And this is where the data pulls us back to reality.
Yeah.
The foundation beneath those mobile phones is incredibly fragile.
Right, because there's a second data point on slide 13 that completely undercuts the mobile boom: secure internet servers.
Yeah, they started at 0.1 per million people and have only recently reached 20 plus per million. That is critically dangerously low.
It reveals a surface-level digitalization. Yes, citizens have mobile phones to text, make calls, and use basic mobile money for peer-to-peer transfers. But secure servers are the heavy infrastructure of a true digital economy.
Explain that for a second. Why do secure servers matter if everyone already has a phone?
Because you can't run a modern productive economy just on SMS and basic peer-to-peer transfers. You need secure, localized servers to host major domestic e-commerce platforms.
Ah,
You need them to digitize government records, tax systems, and land registries, which, by the way, is how you improve that rule of law metric we talked about earlier.
right. If land ownership is digitized and secure, you have legal certainty.
Exactly. You need secure servers to run complex logistical software for supply chains. If you want to build a domestic tech industry, you need server capacity. Right now, Benin is consuming digital services, but they lack the heavy digital infrastructure to actually produce complex digital value.
I want you, the listener, to picture this scene because it perfectly encapsulates the entire deep dive today. Picture a bustling, rapidly growing urban center in Benin. The streets are packed with traffic. The air is thick with exhaust from thousands of imported motorbikes because the physical transit infrastructure is completely overwhelmed.
It's chaotic.
But look closely at the people sitting in that traffic jam. Almost every single one of them, including the young woman who survived a once deadly childhood disease, got an education, but is now forced to sell goods informally on the roadside. Almost every single one of them is holding a mobile phone, instantly connected to the global communications grid.
They are living in the 21st century digital world while physically trapped in a 20th century infrastructure and institutional crisis.
Those contradictions. The cell phone in the traffic jam, the educated young woman working a vulnerable street stall, the massive agricultural demand relying on shrinking plots of land, they perfectly set up the strategic crossroads that Benin is currently standing at.
Which brings us to the ultimate conclusion of this data deck. Slide 15, the strategic outlook.
This slide drops all the charts. It's just pure, clean typography. 3 bullet points and a dark blue emphasis box at the bottom. And the core thesis here is that Benin absolutely must evolve from a survival economy to a production economy.
And based on everything we've unpacked, the transition roadmap they present isn't just a wish list, it's the only logical sequence for survival. First, they must protect the gains they've made. They have to continue to invest in human capital. You cannot let those health and education metrics slip backward.
Right.
But second, and this is the critical bottleneck, they must drastically reform the regulatory environment and the rule of law. They have to make capital feel safe. Without that, they will never attract the foreign direct investment needed to build formal industries and create wage-paying jobs for that massive youth population.
And third, they have to modernize agriculture immediately, before that shrinking land per capita ratio triggers a catastrophic food security crisis that wipes out all the other gains.
It is an incredibly tall order. They are being asked to industrialize, modernize agriculture, build institutions, and manage hyper-urbanization all at the exact same time.
To you listening, wherever you are tuning in from today, whether you're commuting in London, running on a treadmill in New York, or prepping for a meeting in Singapore, you might be wondering why you should care about the macroeconomic metrics of a West African nation. Why does this specific 15-page deck matter to you?
It matters because this is the story of the 21st century. The demographic center of gravity of the human race is shifting toward the global south.
Exactly. If the global south fails to navigate this incredibly complex transition, if the institutional bottlenecks hold and the agricultural squeeze results in failure, the resulting economic stagnation, mass unemployment, and food insecurity will not stay contained.
No, it won't. It will drive massive, unprecedented global migration waves. It will destabilize global supply chains. It will have profound global ripples.
What if they succeed? What if they figure out how to build the airplane while they're already flying it?
If they succeed, they will unlock an economic engine driven by the largest, youngest, most connected workforce on the planet. They will become the new center of global growth and consumer demand.
And that brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with. A provocation to mull over long after this conversation ends. We spent a lot of time today talking about what Benin lacks.
Right, the missing pieces.
They lack heavy industry, they lack legacy physical infrastructure, they lack entrenched formal institutions. But given the explosive leapfrogging rise in mobile connectivity and this massive newly educated youth boom, Could Benin's lack of entrenched 20th century infrastructure actually be a hidden superpower?
Oh, that is a fascinating way to look at it, because they aren't weighed down by the sunk costs of the past. They
Exactly.
don't have trillions of dollars tied up in obsolete fossil fuel grids or outdated landline network that they have to politically defend and slowly dismantle.
Right. Could this blank slate allow them to completely bypass the dirty, carbon-heavy, incredibly inefficient industrial mistakes of the West?
Mm,
What if they don't need to build the old model at all?
It's a huge opportunity.
What if, pushed by necessity, they are uniquely positioned to build the world's first, truly mobile first, green native economy? An economy where agriculture is precision managed via cellular networks, where energy is decentralized solar from day one, and where services are entirely digital.
It's a tantalizing possibility. It would require immense innovation, radical institutional reform, and a lot of courage. But if any demographic has the hunger and the technological baseline to try it, it's a hyper-connected youth population with everything to gain.
Exactly. So we come back to our construction site. Yes, the ground is shifting. Yes, the tenants have moved in early and the supply trucks are delayed. But maybe, just maybe, because they aren't forced to use the old blueprints, they end up building a structure that is entirely new, something the world hasn't seen before. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us today. We'll see you next time.